Okay, so once you have your models poured up and trimmed, the next step is to prep them a little bit and obviously create some keyways so we can mount them. I'm going to use my lathe on high speed and use an egg burr to trim some of the excess stone back here, as well as create keyways on the back of the cast. Okay, so make sure you're using suction, eye protection, a mask for all this. So I'm going to start with a lower, and I want to remove all this and not create any undercuts. Okay. This is no different than making master casts for a new case, as if this was a custom tray with impression material. It's the same thing. So just with an egg burr, I'm going to cut all this away, so I'm cutting all that away now. So this back portion here, as you can see, I'm trying to create a tapered effect so it doesn't create an undercut. It makes it a whole lot easier to invest the case. Trim this back a little bit more. And after you do this, you might find that this portion of the cast might be a little bit overextended, so you might have to go back and trim it again on the model trimmer, which is quite fine. So I'm creating a tapered effect in here as to not to create any undercuts, so it's a lot easier to invest the case. Just going to go over the land area with the egg burr. If you want to get a little bit closer, I'm just going to switch to a tapered burr. So if you recall, when I was positioning the beading wax in order to pour the cast, I left the beading wax a little bit on the high side, and this is the reason why, because I want to have about 1 millimeter worth of stone so I can trim it back and make it look nice here. It's good there. And I'll do the same thing to the maxillary cast. Although this one could have used a little more width for the land area. I'm cutting a little bit close. It'll work, but it could have been a little bit wider just to provide a little more strength. Okay, the next part just do a little bit of housekeeping here. Is to create keyways on the back of the cast. And again, the keyways should be positioned under the thickest part of the cast, which is directly under the ridges, whether it be on the top or the bottom, directly under the ridges. So if you have a hard time seeing it, you can certainly make some pencil marks that way, and another one here. Okay. So I'll start with the maxillary. About half the diameter of the burr. That's how deep you want to score them. Make sure you define each end of the keyway with the tip of the burr, as I'm doing it now, to create a very sharp finish, and that will give you a more locking effect. So you got to turn it back and forth and finish each end of the keyway with the tip of the burr. So again, keep in mind that the keyway here, the center of the keyways, they're parallel, almost parallel to the edge of the cast. Okay, they're almost parallel to the edge of the cast. And that would be parallel to the back of the bottle. So I'll do the same thing on the lower. Okay. So the next step is to clean off a little bit of the wax residue that you might have on the case. So I'm just going to take a little bit of a cloth here with a little wax remover. Especially around the teeth, because we have to mount this in centric occlusion. Just give it a little wipe down, make sure especially the occlusal surfaces are free of any stone debris that might interfere with the bite. But before we mount it into centric, obviously, we have to mount the maxillary cast. And for this particular case, we didn't use a Facebook transfer, although you could have acquired a Facebook transfer from your client. But in most cases, you won't. But what we can do is utilize the mid-palatal suture here that we can kind of derive from our denture and transfer that to the model, to the underside of the cast. And I suggest you use this method all the time, regardless what you do, whether it's a full denture or a partial, to mount. Just gonna get a ruler. Can never find a ruler when you need one, but that's okay. I'll just use the handle of the surgical blade here. So that way, when I'm mounting this on the articulator, and I'm going to use an average mounting method, I want to make sure that this line is perpendicular to the hinge axis of the articulator. So it's not deviated one way or another, because that will interfere with verifying lateral excursions. Okay, so I'm going to mount this using the average mounting method, meaning I want to make sure my midline is centered. And also, I'm going to position this model so the base of the model is centered under the mounting ring. Okay. To prevent this model from moving around during applying the plaster, make sure that I'm centered. I'm just going to take a little bit of base plate wax. Make sure I'm centered again, so that looks pretty good. And seal it a little bit on the side. Going to turn it over so you can see it on camera. So I got my plane of occlusion, so secure the model to the mounting plate with some base plate wax or sticky wax, whatever you prefer. I prefer base plate wax. It's just a lot easier to boil off after. And from this point on, we're just going to apply a little bit of separator on the back of the model. I like that technique because it makes it a whole lot easier to remove the model off the mounting when we start investing the case. Okay, so I'm going to mix some plaster off camera. Just a fine coat of separator. That's all you need. Sure you wipe off maybe a little bit of the excess that you might have in there, especially inside the keyways. Make sure that your pin is at 0 when you're mounting it. Make sure that your centric latches are locked, they're not open or displaced. And also make sure that your condylar guidance is set as 0, although that doesn't have any deal of impact on the mounting. And make sure that there's no play in your articulator. I'm trying to move it back and forth, slide it from side to side so there's no play in here. Okay, so I'm going to mix a little bit of plaster. Whenever you're mixing any type of stone, you should be using the vibrator, obviously. I'm not going to for this demo. And the reason why you want to vibrate, whether you're using plaster or stone, because you will get a much consistent mix and a much stronger mix. And a mix that will set much faster as well. So I'm just going to hand spatulate a little bit longer than normal because I don't have access to the vibrator right now. Okay, that should be good. The first layer, you just want to take a little bit of plaster, just the tip of your spatula, and work it inside the keyways. Don't put too much now, so you can manipulate the plaster a little bit easier and not having overflowing all over the place. I'm going to wipe off the excess here, top it off with some more, and I'm actually overlapping the model a little bit, which is very difficult to see on camera right now. But the plaster is beyond the edge of the model. And then I'll just take my spatula and cut it back. Just to have a little more control. I'll add some more on top. And then I'm also going to add some inside the mounting ring. So once again, make sure you squish it in there so it gets all the way inside the undercut. And now I'm going to close the articulator and assess if I have enough plaster, which I think I do. Want to turn it over so you guys can see it on the video as well. So I have enough plaster, so when I close it, there's enough plaster there to squish it down together and kind of make sure you have more than what you need. So from this point on, we can take our spatula and make sure that we have ample plaster between the mounting ring and the model. And I'm just going to use my spatula here to shape the plaster, so there's very little work to do. Just going to scrape it up against the cast so we have a nice junction between the plaster and the model, or the base of the model. And all you would really have to do after you're done, if you do it correctly, maybe just use a little bit of sandpaper to smooth things out. And this mounting technique is the same mounting technique you would use for a new case as well. The only difference is you would have bite blocks instead of having denture bases to mount. No different. Shape it back here. So I'm using the edge of the spatula to especially clean the junction between the plaster and the edge of the cast. That's very important because it creates a nice visual when you're remounting the case after you process, or if you have to remount the case if you're working on a new case. Let's say you do a check bite and you have to remount something. It's very important. So that's good. Just give it a final look. Now normally this wax you would boil off, but just to keep the video running, since I don't want to break it up in 2 videos, I'm just gonna try to scrape some of this wax off. Just pry this off the denture. Let it set a little bit, more than I have here. But just for the sake of timing for the video, I'm going to rush it a little bit. I can remove the mounting plate here. Scrape off some of the excess wax. And I'm going to use a little bit of wax remover to remove the rest of the wax residue. And from here on, all we got to do is mount our lower model. Now before I do that, make sure that you don't have any interference back here with your models. So it looks like I'm free of any interference there. So basically we're mounting things at the centric occlusion, and I just barely cleared it there, so I'm good. So I'm going to hold things together in centric, and once again I'm going to use a little bit of base plate wax to tag things together. On each side. So that'll hold things together. And I can leave my articulator now upside down. And once again, I'm going to apply some separator, a very fine film on the back of the lower cast. Just wipe off some of the residue here, or you can just spray it off. And we'll mix some more plaster to mount the lower. Now the lower model, with its base being a little bit wider, common sense will tell you just to mix a little more plaster than you did before, so you don't scrambling to mix another batch. Obviously that's way too thick, so I'm just going to add a little more water. If you thought you added too much water there, before you spatulate, just drain some of it out before you start spatulating. There's enough moisture in there, so I just drained it. There's enough moisture in there to get a nice mix. That's good. Once again, you should be doing this over a vibrator. But if you had to, depending on the circumstances, you can certainly hand spatulate. Let's not forget our lower mounting ring, because that's not going to work without it. Okay, so once again, just a very small amount, just to put a small skim coat on the back of the cast. Feels like this plaster is kind of setting a whole lot faster than the upper mounting, which is okay. So I got to work a little bit faster here. So now I can hold my articulator, pick it up off the bench. So I'm clamping it together with my fingers, in my hands I should say. Make sure you work the plaster in all the little fine areas of the ring. And now it's at a nice consistency where it's starting to set, that I can start scraping it off and shape it. Just make sure that you hold it, you pinch it together, or you clamp it together so things don't fall apart. And again, I'm using the edge of my spatula, which is fairly sharp, to scrape off the excess plaster and give it a nice overall shape. I can certainly go in here with a smaller instrument and cut away some of the excess plaster in here. What you don't see, the extra plaster that's on my spatula, I'm just scraping it on the side of the bench, which is off camera here. That's why you see a clean spatula every time I scrape it. And then you can just simply wipe it off at the end. So it's important to have the base of the model free of any plaster overlapping it to create a nice visual when you have to perform a laboratory remount. Scrape a little bit here, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to let this plaster set for about 10-15 minutes at least, and then at which point I'm going to boil off the wax that's holding the case together, and then we'll go to the next step that will allow us to prepare the lower denture base for the spacer that will accommodate the soft liner, and then we'll prepare the maxillary base, which will perform a permanent, not soft liner, hard reline / rebate. So we'll go through that simultaneously at the same time.